Here they are. Hello.
Right. Sorry. Can can anyone who's not me or Ralph just say you can now hear, you're in the meeting?
Yeah,
In the
we can,
meeting and can hear.
Right.
and we can
Thank
see
you.
the screen.
I'm so sorry. It's my technological illiteracy. I'd actually forgotten to start the meeting. So Ralph started, I was listening, but no one else could hear. I'm really sorry about that. So I'm glad everyone's now in the meeting and it started. Apologies to Ralph, who was 5 minutes in and is going to have to start again. I do apologize. My technological illiteracy, not for the first time, probably not for the last time. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to pass straight back to Ralph to start again. Okay, apologies.
That's fine. Ben, you'll be able to see if there's any discrepancies in what I said previously and what I say now. So yeah, hi everyone. Nice to see you all in the meeting now. My name's Ralph. I'm a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Bristol, where I'm looking at various aspects of this question of the relationship between people's education and their political attitudes and behaviour. This is one project from that kind of bigger project where I'm working with Hannah Bunting, Rob Ford, and Maria Soboleska to look at this question of whether higher education is a new political cleavage in Britain. And you'll notice that there are kind of two funder logos. My work on this has been supported by the Leverhulme Trust, but the data collection was supported by the ESRC through a UK and a Changing Europe fellowship that Rob held. So thanks to both of those for supporting this work. I'll just make sure I can move along. There we go. So to kind of, I guess, introduce the topic and why we think it's important, why we're studying it. It's increasingly the case, or well observed, that education is important in predicting people's political attitudes and behaviour, and increasingly so. And this applies not just in the British context, but across a kind of range of established democracies. There's nice in-depth studies of this in the US and across Europe. People are increasingly interested in this question. And focusing on the British context in particular, the graduate status divides people on particular issues. So immigration, which is again topical this week, is one where there's quite a strong education gradient, and it also has kind of driven this educational divide. Arguably, has driven the emergence of new parties. At least partly driven the emergence of parties like Reform, and also what you could call the kind of red wall strategy of the Conservatives after Brexit, where they were at least in part kind of targeting the votes of voters with low to no qualifications in particular parts of Britain. And on this basis, some have made the argument that education represents a new cleavage across Western Europe in this paper that Rob and Will Jennings worked on, where they make that argument. And I guess in this paper we're essentially testing it in the British context, trying to put some more empirical meat on that particular question. And we extrapolate from the Danish case. So Rune Stubager, about, well, more than 10 years ago now, looked at this question in depth in Denmark. And we're looking at the British context to see if higher education represents a new political cleavage here. So to move on from that, to go into more depth on what we mean by these concepts and the kind of literature that we're building on in doing this work. And to start with talking about cleavage theory, which many of you will be very familiar with, but just to kind of explain what we mean by it in this context. So this was first proposed in this 1967 paper by Lipset and Rocan. The kind of core argument, if we boil it down to one bullet point, as I understand it, is that these social divisions which kind of exist in society find their expression through political party systems, which in turn are frozen and persist once the strength of the original divide has subsided. So the kind of examples they give in that original paper are things like the social class division between the working class and the middle class, or sectarian divides between Protestants and Catholics, and these kind of find their representation in party systems. As an influential paper, it produced lots more research, and there's a kind of a further articulation of what, because the original paper was fairly vague on like a specific definition of what's required to demonstrate a political cleavage. Bartolini and Mayer build on this to kind of be more specific and argue that it comprises three elements. So the first of these is a difference in social structure. So something that you can kind of empirically observe based on people's descriptive characteristics. So that would be a kind of occupational class distinction, or in this case, an educational distinction between graduates and non-graduates. Then there's also a normative divide, which means a divide in values and beliefs and identity and group consciousness. And it's this aspect of identity and group consciousness that we're focusing on in this paper, which is based on that descriptive difference. And then thirdly, a kind of institutional difference. So the extent to which the divide is mobilized by political institutions, such as political parties and politicians. So as I've already kind of hinted at, in the post-war period, social class was the dominant political cleavage throughout most of the democratic world. And in lots of the kind of, I guess, the foundational text of empirical British political science, that's the main focus, right? Is the kind of class divide and how that's mobilized. But as many of you will know, the 20th century saw this long period of class de-alignment where people became less likely to vote in accordance with their kind of objective class position. And there's been various studies as to why this might be, including kind of deindustrialization, the rise of the knowledge economy, the effect of globalization and immigration, and kind of all of that resulting in socio-structural changes which lead to a realignment along a new cultural dimension. And people have lots of different ways of talking about this new dimension, but it's the kind of non-economic one that relates more to these cultural or social issues. And there's been in the kind of last 6 months or so, there's been a recent proliferation of really interesting research talking about the relationship between cleavage politics and this new dimension. And much of this focuses on the importance of social identity. So in a kind of short book that was published towards the end of last year, Bornshire and co-authors argue that the extent to which the kind of relative strength of someone's group identity, it mediates the relationship between their group membership. So, you know, whether or not they are working class or being a graduate, and their political behavior. And this is important because people don't only have one social identity; they have kind of multiple competing identities. So it's the extent to which they feel strongly about that identity that impacts their how it affects their politics. And in a paper where she analyzes lots of open text response kind of survey data, Zollinger finds that what you could characterize as the kind of losers of this new global knowledge economy, so essentially the kind of traditional industrial working class in deindustrializing countries, are more disposed to far-right political parties in part because they're more likely to identify with something which is a positive identity. So their occupational identity is kind of in low status, and instead they identify with a kind of more positive identity, such as a national or even an ethnic identity, to avoid this loss of status. So given the importance of kind of social identity in this to the kind of cleavage theory as it relates to this second dimension, this cultural dimension, we need to know a bit more about social identity. And again, lots of the people in this room or kind of interested in political psychology will be very familiar with this, but I'm just going to recap it for our purposes. So the argument within the kind of this was first introduced by Teifel and colleagues, and it's essentially the idea of a social identity is firstly that you have an awareness that you're a member of a particular social group, and also that you have a value judgment of that membership. So I'm working class and proud of it, or I'm a graduate and that's a good thing. You kind of have this evaluation as to whether or not your group membership is a good or a bad thing. And as applied in political science, group identity is usually measured through things like feelings of closeness to different groups, or sentiment towards those groups, or preference towards members of groups, whether in group or out groups. And essentially what we're doing here is testing different ways of measuring this in terms of educational social identity in this paper, which I'll come to shortly. In a really interesting recent paper, Westhäuser and Zollinger argue that there's two processes by which social structure translates into group identity. And they kind of reinforce one another. So the first is almost like an organic process of social closure, whereby through kind of proximity and similarity, groups kind of find themselves. They demarcate an in-group and an out-group. So the process of going to university, I think, would help to establish that kind of social identity in that way, or that sense of being part of an in-group. The second is one which is more top down, and they describe it as a classification struggle, whereby leaders, and these might be political or social or cultural leaders, make claims on a group's behalf to kind of advance their interests. And this has two effects. One is that it benefits the individual making the claim. So they kind of become a champion of a given group. They might be like someone who's standing up for the working class, for example. That's how they portray themselves. And they become legitimate as a result. But it also legitimates the distinction. So it also makes that kind of class distinction more salient to people, and it makes people aware of their membership of a social group as part of this kind of classification struggle. And so this is all a way of saying that as kind of political cleavages emerge, they may not be symmetrical, as in one side might be more conscious of this divide and lean into it more in terms of their politics than another side of the cleavage. So in terms of going back to the kind of Bartolini and Mayer requirements for there to be a political cleavage, on the first point, I think it's fair to say that there's an observable empirical difference, and it's possible that this is partly coming to the fore, in part because it used to be the case that the graduate population was such a minority, and it no longer is. There's the kind of about 34% of the British population hold a degree, and that's growing just because of the age structure, basically, because around 50% of young people in Britain now go to university and gain a degree. There are also substantial educational divides in values and beliefs. So on that kind of second point, that's one component of it, basically. Graduates in Britain are more socially liberal and are less ethnocentric, as I've said, in terms of the immigration question. And this is more anecdotal, and I'm interested in looking at this more systematically, but this division has also been mobilized by political actors. So as I've said, the support for Brexit and reform is really predicted by education. But also there's been this pops up every so often, and I think it would be interesting to study it systematically in terms of kind of negative rhetoric around universities from some political leaders, where Farage in the election campaign described universities as madrasas of Marxism, and recently Kemi Badenoch said that higher education in Britain is poisoning the mind of young people, I think, something to that effect. But there's limited evidence on the extent to which the education divide represents a social identity divide. So as I say, that's what we're testing here. So moving on to the empirics and starting with the method. So as I've said, there's good evidence that undergraduate status affects political attitudes and behaviour, but for it to represent a political cleavage and a kind of social, for there to be there would need to be educational social identity. And so we need to find that graduates and non-graduates identify with their educational own group. That's a kind of validation hypothesis, essentially. The second is that this educational social identity that we're testing translates into support for political parties. And then the third is that educational social identity also translates into support for appropriate candidates. So I'm going to talk about how we're going to test each of those things. To do this, we commissioned YouGov to survey over 3,000 British voting age adults, and we sampled from the British Election Study Internet panel so that we could link to Wave 25 data, which gives us access to a kind of more rich set of variables than we would have on our own. The fieldwork was carried out towards the end of 2023, and the analysis is weighted by YouGov's standard weights, which include targets for gender, age, education, social grade, political attention, Brexit vote, and 2019 general election vote. The measures that we develop, there's 3 of them, and so those are the kind of ones we're testing and developing through this paper. They relate to kind of closeness, group consciousness, and in-group preference, and I'll present each of them. I'll go through each of them in turn. So closeness is the most straightforward, where essentially we ask people on this scale, how do you feel closer to? There's people sometimes say there's 2 distinct groups: university graduates and non-graduates. Do you feel closer to university graduates or closer to non-graduates? And they can also say they feel equally close to both groups. And then that's the extent of the scale. Basically, it's the kind of most straightforward, almost like a closeness, almost like a feeling thermometer, although not quite. The second is more explicit and I guess kind of politicized in what we're asking about, as it talks about the kind of consequences for university graduates for society. So there are 6 items in this scale. It's kind of 5-point strongly agree, strongly disagree response options. And 3 are coded in the direction of being pro-graduate and 3 are coded in the direction of being anti-graduate. And they're basically driving at this point, are graduates driving society, graduates leading society in the right direction? Are university graduates out of touch? Yeah, so I guess it kind of gets more at this politicized aspect of the educational divide. The third is probably the subtlest of all of them in terms of measurement, and this is where we're trying to tap into in-group preference, where we ask people across a range of 9 jobs that that are on the kind of right of this slide, whether they think those jobs should require a university degree or not. Some of these are jobs which in the British context do, and some don't, and some didn't used to and now do. So there's a kind of degree of variation in what people might prefer here, and we essentially just average across the scale to give an overall pro-graduate bias. If you think it's a good idea that graduates should be in jobs, jobs should require a degree in general, to construct that scale. In terms of the other variables, the outcomes that we look at are vote intention, but given the kind of particular context of when that was recorded and how things have changed since then in terms of the structure of vote intention, we also look at party-like scores because it gives us a bit more variation, particularly in terms of the smaller parties. And we also look at candidate preference through a candidate choice survey experiment, which I'll talk in more detail before I present the results in terms of the method for that. The controls that we include throughout for all of these analyses I'm going to present are age, gender, occupational class measured using the NSEC analytic, which I think is 8 categories, gross household income in 5 bands, and then really importantly, graduate status. So everything you see in terms of the results here is net of educational status. So it's kind of like the additional effect beyond that effect of education itself. And using these measures, we test our expectations. So we've got this validation hypothesis, and the way we test that is looking at conditional mean differences in the social identity measures by education. We want to see if social identity translates into support for political parties. So that's what we do with the relationship between educational social identity and party support outcomes. And then we use the candidate survey experiment to test whether educational social identity drives support for particular candidates. So onto the results, and this is the results of that validation hypothesis. In each of the panels here, you can see each of the measures. So the closeness, the consciousness, and the in-group preference measure. And then for each of them, I presented the kind of conditional means for graduates and non-graduates. And you can see that there's a stark difference, as in graduates do feel closer to graduates or feel that graduates are leading society in the right direction or have a preference for graduates in jobs. And the same is true in the other direction for non-graduates. You can also see that there's the difference varies across the measures. So some, I guess, are more, more sensitive, or there are bigger differences between graduates and non-graduates on these measures, particularly with the job measures. So it's worth bearing that in mind when it comes to the kind of the next stage of the analysis, I think. Looking first at vote intention, and this is the panels are the same. So group closeness, group consciousness, and in-group preference. I'm presenting all of the measures together, as it were. And this is a logit model of kind of reported vote intention. So it's the predicted probability of supporting a party as predicted by, so it's the kind of model coefficients, but converted into predicted probabilities. The consistent pattern here is that being anti-graduate across all of these measures means that you're more likely to vote for Reform UK, or more likely to say you will vote for Reform UK. It's also the case that across 2 of these measures, being more pro-graduate means you're more likely to vote for the Labour Party. But as I say, I think you get a better sense of what's going on from the kind of party liking data, and that's what's presented here. So across each of the measures, to a kind of different degree for the measures, but fairly consistently, the parties of the broad liberal left in the British context, so that's Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the Greens, it's consistently the case that that being pro-graduate means you are more likely to like these parties by somewhere between half a point to a whole point on a 0 to 10 scale. Um, the opposite is true for liking reform. Um, so if you don't like if you're the more the more pro-graduate you are, the less likely you are to vote for reform, and vice versa. And what's interesting is it's not a particularly good predictor of conservative support. And I think if we look at the marginal means, it gives you. I think I like this way of presenting it because I think it gives you a good sense of on this dimension at least the kind of relative exchangeability of Labour, the Greens, and the Lib Dems. I mean, it doesn't explain everything, but in terms of people's willingness to switch, at least in this at this point in time on this dimension, people, there's not a huge amount of distinction between those parties. Whereas on the other side of things, reform seems much more polarized on this particular issue, as in much more anti-graduate than the Conservatives are. And I think this makes sense when you think about the composition of reform's leadership and kind of like what it represents, whereby most of its leader and its MPs tend to be kind of entrepreneurs or people who are from non-graduate backgrounds, whereas the Conservative Party, I think, will struggle to really get an edge on this, where most of its leadership, both now and historically, have attended elite universities, and kind of it's a tougher thing for them to campaign on, I think, and to attract support as regards. So that's the kind of party preference findings. To move on to talk about candidate preference. So, and for this, we carried out a survey experiment. So in the experiment, we asked people to consider 2 candidates for local councillor. We randomized 7 characteristics. So that's education, gender, age, localness, profession, income, and a political issue that they're interested in, the candidate is interested in. Candidate's education has 4 levels. So whether they left school at 16, left school at 18, have a degree in chemistry or a PhD in chemistry. And we're particularly interested in how the average marginal component effect of education varies by these the respondents' education variables. And so with a kind of sample size of over 3,000, 4 levels of education and an expected effect size of 0.05, which is based on Lizzie Simon and Stuart Turnbull-Dugate's meta-analysis of studies like this, candidate experiments like this. We estimate a statistical power of 87%, which is kind of above the conventional threshold. So we're fairly happy with that. To present the education results without any interactions, so this is just the AMCE of education. So we're controlling for the effects of all the other randomized characteristics, but we're not looking at anything at the respondent level. There's basically no gradient by education. So the average voter doesn't have any preferences in terms of their local councillor candidate's education. But that picture changes significantly when we adjust for respondents' education. When we interact with respondents' education. So those non-graduates have a strong non-graduate preference among politicians, and graduates have a strong graduate preference, or fairly strong. And this is also the case for the educational social identity measures. So the same pattern is shown in terms of group closeness and group consciousness, whereby the more pro-graduate you are, the more you prefer a candidate with a degree or a PhD in chemistry, and the less you prefer a candidate who left school without going to university. On the job measures, on the in-group preference measure, there's the only 2 that demonstrate a strong relationship are the more extremes. So whether you left school at 16 and had a PhD in chemistry, and it could be due to the nature of that measure and kind of what it kind of demonstrates about expectations of politicians in terms of the kind of qualifications I guess those 2 PhD or leaving school at 16 would be the more extreme elements, as in you'd find those less represented among councillors. But yeah, that's the interpretation of that. I'm still thinking through in terms of why that varies. Yes. So to summarise, to summarise, So we find some kind of like initial evidence that higher education represents an emerging political cleavage in Britain, in particular this point around social identity. So graduates and non-graduates identify with their in-group, they feel more closer to and more positive about them, and this educational social identity motivates party and candidate support, even accounting for the effects of education itself. And in the choice experiment, those with stronger educational social identity were more likely to support in-group candidates. And this suggests the educational divide will continue to kind of contribute to the restructuring of party competition in Britain, as we've seen over the last 10 years or so. And that's it. I'll draw to a close there. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks a lot, Ralph. Great project, great presentation. I suspect that people might have some questions on that. So people should fire away. Oh, actually, hang on a second. Sorry, let me just stop the recording.